Our next topic is percents. Now this may be something you've never thought about before, but percents are really just a special kind of fraction. And if you understand that connection between fractions and percents, you'll have a much better understanding of what percents really mean and how they work. That word percent means out of 100, and that's really the dead giveaway about the connection between percents and fractions. We've talked about with fractions that we need to be very careful about thinking about what the whole is. So if this square represents one whole, we could divide that square into 10 equal pieces and say that we have 10 tenths. Or we could divide that square into 100 equal pieces and say that we have 100 hundredths. Now that's exactly what we did when we were looking at decimals. We said that decimals were fractional parts of a whole that had denominators that were powers of 10. Well, the important thing about percents is that we're really thinking about just those 100 hundredths, since percent means out of 100. So a percent is really a very specialized kind of fraction, which means it's a very specialized kind of decimal number as well. So we're going to keep thinking about these pictures as we look at percents and think about them as representing fractions. Think about them as representing rational numbers. So if I'm looking at something like 41%, I'm going to think about 41% as meaning 41 out of 100, or 41 100ths. So if the big square is one whole, and I've divided that whole into 100 hundredths, then 41% is 41 of those hundredths. So 41% would be represented by the yellow part of the whole that we see here. 160% would mean 160 hundredths. And what would that look like? Well, we know that one whole is divided into 100 hundredths, and then we need 60 more hundredths to have 160 hundredths. So 160% is actually more than one whole. What if we have something like 0.5%? That's 5/10ths of a percent. What does that mean? Well, remember, percent means out of 100. So 5/10ths of a percent is 5/10ths out of 100. It's 5/10ths hundredths. And we know that when we write rational numbers, we have to have integers in the numerator and denominator. So if we think about those 5/10ths of a hundredth, we actually have 5 1,000ths, or 1/200th. So 5/10ths of a percent, half of a percent, is 1/2 of 1 100th, or 1/200th. And then 100% would mean 100 hundredths. So if we think about our area model, we would have all 100 of the hundredth shaded in, which means 100% is the same as one whole. Now, since fractions and decimals and percents are all closely related, we can certainly take numbers that are written in one of those forms and write them in any of the other forms. So let's start by thinking about how to write percents as fractions. So imagine we have 16% and we want to write it as a fraction. We know that percent means out of 100, so 16 hundredths represents 16%, and 16 hundredths can be simplified as 4 25ths. So 16% has the same value as 4 25ths as a fraction. If we want to write a percent as a decimal, we can think of the same sort of thing. After all, 16% is 16 hundredths. So 16 hundredths is a number that we could write as a decimal, 0.16, which means 16 hundredths. Now, one thing to notice here is that when we start with a percent and we want to write it as a decimal, since percent means out of 100, that means we're really taking that 16 and dividing it by 100, which will move the decimal point 2 places to the left. In fact, anytime we change a percent to a decimal, we'll be moving the decimal point 2 places to the left. So if we have something like 175%, we can rewrite that as 1.75, 1 75 hundredths, because we only need to move that decimal point that's behind the 5 in the 175% to the left 2 places. How about this? 0.05%. So that's 5 hundredths of a percent. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that just because you see a decimal in a number doesn't mean that it's considered a decimal. In fact, in this case, because we see a percent sign in this number represents a percent, but it's a very small percent. What we'd like to do is write it as a decimal. So, since percent means out of 100, we're going to take that 0.05, that 5 hundredths, and divide it by 100 to change it to a decimal number. So that moves the decimal point 2 places to the left, and we get this very, very small number, 0.0005. That's 5, let's see, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths. That's 5 10,000ths. Fractions can be written as percents as well. Sometimes we have to work a little harder at that, though, changing fractions to percents. It really depends upon the denominator of the fraction. So let's say we want to write 5/20ths as a percent. Now remember that percent means out of 100. So if we can see an easy way to rewrite this fraction as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100, we'll be on our way to writing this as a percent. So by multiplying numerator and denominator of 5/20ths by 5, we get the equivalent fraction 25 hundredths. And remember, hundredths means the same thing as percent. So 25 hundredths is 25 out of 100, and that would be 25%. So 5/20ths is the same thing as 25%. Now, if you have a fraction that has a denominator that cannot easily be multiplied by something to give you 100, then you have a little different approach to changing it to a percent. Remember, percent means out of 100, so we're going to write this as a proportion. And we're going to say 1/6 is the same thing as how many hundredths. So 1/6 is the same thing as x over 100. If we cross multiply and solve, we'll get x equals 50/3. And we can take that 50/3 and rewrite it as a mixed number to get x equals 16 2/3. Now remember, the x was a number out of 100, and we're trying to write this as a percent. So 16 2/3 out of 100 means 16 2/3%. So 1/6 is the same thing as 16 2/3%. If we start with a decimal number, we can write it as a percent as well. So let's say we have the decimal number 37 hundredths, and we want to write that as a percent. Now keep in mind, we just said a percent if we said 37 hundredths, because a percent means out of 100. So 37 hundredths is the same thing as 37%. Now you may have noticed that to change that decimal to a percent, we also can think about moving the decimal point over. So 37 hundredths written as a percent is the same thing as 37%. If we just move that decimal number in the decimal value 0.37, move that decimal point 2 places to the right. So to change a decimal to a percent, we can move the decimal point 2 places to the right. So if we start with this decimal number, very small decimal number, 4/10,000ths, how do we write it as a percent? Well, we can just move the decimal point 2 places to the right, and we get 0.04%, 4/100ths of a percent, that's equivalent to the decimal number 4/10,000ths. How about this larger number, 36.7, 36 7/10ths? How do we write that as a percent? We can do exactly the same thing. We can move the decimal point 2 places to the right and get 3,670%. It might be useful to keep in mind that 100% is equivalent to the number 1. So any number that's bigger than 1 will be bigger than 100%. And certainly 36.7 was much bigger than 1. So we're going to have a percent much bigger than 100%. So we're going to encounter some percent problems that we'll want to solve. And the percent proportion is a way that we can solve percent problems. Remember we said percent is a number out of 100. So we can also think of a percent as representing a part of a whole. Now the percent itself is a part of 100, but we also know that we can compare a part to a whole when the whole is not out of 100. For example, what if we want to know what 20% of 18 is? 20% is a percent. And what we're asking is, if we have 20%, if we have 20 out of 100, what part of a whole of 18 is that? What part of a whole of 18 is it? Now, one thing that can be really helpful when we're working with percent proportions is we have to figure out what the part is, what the whole is, and what the percent is. In this case, the percent was given to us. It was 20%. The whole will be the value that we see immediately after the word of, because we're looking for a part of a whole. So in this case, 18 immediately followed the word of. That means we know 18 is the whole. So what we're looking for is the part. So if we cross multiply and solve, we get x equals 3.6. So that tells us that 20% of 18 is 3.6. Now if you relate this to some of the things we've already talked about with fractions, 20%, 20/100ths, is 1/5. So this is another way of saying what is 1/5 of 18. 1/5 of 18 is 3.6. Here's another problem that involves the percent proportion. 3 is 6% of what number? Now we're going to think about this percent proportion, that the percent, which represents a number out of 100, is equal to the part of a whole. In this problem, we've been given the percent, but we don't know the whole. We don't know out of what number. The 3 is a part of that whole. So we know that 6%, 6 out of 100, is the same thing as a part of 3 out of a whole that we don't know. We can cross multiply and solve and get x equals 50. So the question was, 3 is 6% of what number? Well, 3 is 6% of the number 50. Now we'll also see percent problems in real life problems as well. And here's an example of that. A dress that normally sells for $80 is on sale for $52. What is the percent off? So let's think about how much money was taken off the price first. That's called the markdown. The dress started off at $80 and it was on sale for $52. So the markdown, the amount of money that was taken off of the price is $28. We want to know the percent off. So what we want to know is if we start off with this $80 dress and we take $28 off of that price, what percent off is that? So we don't know the percent off, but we do know that we have taken $28 as a part of the whole cost of the dress, which was $80. So in terms of our percent proportion, we don't know the percent, we don't know how much out of 100, but we do know that the amount that was taken off of the price was 28 out of the $80 that the dress started out as. So if we cross multiply and solve, we get x equals 35. Now remember, the x was a percent. It was the amount out of 100. So the percent off is 35%. The dress is 35% off. So that's the end of our discussion on percents. Now you may feel like there's maybe a little more that we can do with percents, and there is. We're going to be practicing more problems in class.